Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'm going to be discussing the Mythic Plus affix for Season 2, how I recommend handling each, including all three of the brand new affixes in Afflicted, Incorporeal, and Entangling, but also discussing some of the pretty big changes to existing affixes like Raging and Bolstering, and how that changes your strategy. If you want to learn more about the Season 2 dungeons themselves, things like what mobs are important, how to route through them, I have individual guide videos for that, as well as a pug-friendly routing video over on my channel, and I'll link those down in the description below if you want to check them out. Otherwise, let's first quickly talk about the changes to existing affixes before hopping into the new ones, starting with the one I'm probably the most happy about, Bolstering. With 10.1, we are seeing a pretty massive positive change to this affix, as it will no longer increase the health of a bolstered enemy, only damage. A huge complaint that I've had personally, and I've seen a lot with other people as well, is that this affix is pretty punishing for packs that have mobs of varying health values, like a lieutenant mob or some smaller mobs. It also prevents you from chain pulling in dungeons because you'll be bolstering up basically entire packs from the very beginning or close to the beginning, which makes it a net time loss to chain pull, even if it does feel pretty bad, especially for certain specs, to not be chain pulling. Overall, Bolstering was also one of the more punishing affixes across the board, and especially when it came to timing keys, as it had one of the lowest in-time rate of all affixes back in Season 1 of Dragonflight. This change, I think, fantastic. Gives you some counterplay to the affix as opposed to just adding time because you wanted to chain pull or you accidentally butt pulled something, for example. Will it be dangerous to chain pull? Potentially, for sure, as you'll be giving mobs a full damage amp early on in the pull. However, it still gives you the opportunity to outplay that, which I absolutely love. Bolstering weeks, no longer going to be dead weeks, and I am here for it. Next up, we have Raging. This one I'm not as sure about as Bolstering. This affix was actually changed entirely. It's no longer a 50% damage done increase when the mobs enrage. Instead, the enraged mobs will be immune to crowd control for 20 seconds. Couple of notes here. Interrupts do still work with this buff, so you can still kick mobs. If these are mobs that you want to kick, that will still work just fine without the Soothe. And speaking of Soothe, second thing to note, this buff is still an enrage, so it will expire after 20 seconds, but you can also soothe it, so there is some counterplay there. Still though, I can definitely see some situations where, at least in hierarchies, you will almost feel forced to play an evoker, as they're kind of the only class that has an AoE soothe in their kit, right? A great example, I think maybe some people have found it out this week, is those imp packs in Court of Stars. Granted, this is a Season 1 dungeon, but I'm sure there's going to be something applicable for Season 2. Those imps though, like, they're kickable. There's way too many in a single pack, though, to reliably get all those kicks, and so you instead had to depend on those AoE stops. Because these mobs all have the same amount of health, they're going to enrage at pretty much the same time because it's a relatively low number, and then once they do enrage, unless you have an evoker, there's really no way for you to be able to start seeing those mobs again and prevent people from getting one-shot by them, essentially. That being said, outside of kind of specific niche scenarios like that, I do think this affix is significantly less punishing for the average player, particularly in those mid to low level keys, right? And for tank players kind of across the board, as that 50% damage amp, poorly timed, could mean a wipe in a lot of situations. You'll definitely still want at least one Soothe in your group though during these weeks, but your Soothe priority is definitely going to shift from those high unavoidable damage mobs that it was previously onto mobs that have more important abilities that you want to use a stop for. Overall, I'm going to reserve judgment on this one for now, but it could be better, could be worse, we'll have to see. Then we have Spiteful, and this change definitely falls into the very positive category, as not only have they reduced their melee damage by 10%, but they also no longer scale in health or damage after a plus 20 key. This makes these mobs way more fair to deal with, as previously on higher key levels, the melees of Spiteful were either one-shots or very close to one-shots, and there were times where it felt like it was just a little unfair, right? They would be auto-attacking maybe the instant they pick the fixate, or maybe even slightly before it felt like, or they would hit you from super far away, right? The long arms of Spiteful, I'm sure a lot of people have experienced that. It just kind of felt bad given the amount of damage that they actually dealt. Some occasions also, there were maybe low health mobs in a pack, and that would cause Spitefuls to spawn early on when everything else was still alive, and that would feel pretty bad if it ended up choosing a melee who was just in their cooldowns, and they're like, well, guess I have to leave the pack now, otherwise I'm going to get one shot by this mob, right? So nice to see those damage nerfs potentially in that situation. You can just say, no, I'm going to do damage now. You pop like a big defensive and just kind of eat the Spiteful hits. Maybe you can stun the Spiteful and cleave it down with their less health. Something just, for the most part, you couldn't mitigate before in higher keys is now something you can. On top of that, another annoying thing, if you had to do any sort of interaction to move between platforms or areas of a dungeon, like in Azure Vault in Season 1 as an example, the portal between platforms. You couldn't do it if you were in combat. Spiteful, of course, kept you in combat. Them having reduced health scaling or no health scaling at all above a 20 is going to make that process take a lot less time. So overall, bunch of total wins here for Spiteful. They aren't really going to change how you play with this affix. As I mentioned, maybe there's a situation where you choose to just stun a Spiteful in the middle of a pack, cleave it down, or pop a defensive and let it hit you a few times. But otherwise, you're probably going to be playing Spiteful relatively similarly. Sanguine also saw a very minor change here with the puddle duration dropping from 20 seconds to 12 seconds. Personally, I don't really think this does much at all to this affix. You're going to play it exactly the same, and the moments that were the most punishing before, which is like bathing a lieutenant mob that has a cast and a Sanguine for the entire duration of the cast, healing them up to full health, that's still going to be a thing, right? That doesn't change at all with this adjustment to Sanguine. Would have liked to see maybe make Sanguine puddles shrink every time they heal, put a cap on them. Maybe Sanguine is like a timed heal or absorb on the mob, or like a magic absorb on the mob, but you know, maybe we'll see that in 10.2. Now, let's get into the new affixes, which, for those who don't know, will be replacing Quaking, Explosive, and Grievous in the Mythic Plus affix pool. Those three are gone. These three ones are in, and to start, let's talk Entangling, which will attach a vine to every player that slows them by 30% for 8 seconds. If you don't break this vine within that 8-second time frame, you'll be stunned for 3 seconds, but luckily, they are actually quite easy to break. You simply need to move 10 yards outside of the circle that'll pop up when this affix goes out, and the snare breaks instantly. You can also, of course, use movement freeing effects or immunities to break it instantly without having to move at all. Things like Avatar, Druid, Shapeshift, Freedom, Tiger's Lust, much more. There's a big long list of them, so it's pretty nice there. You can move or you can use one of those abilities. This affix happens approximately every 30 seconds in combat, so unlike something like the old Quaking affix that it's replacing, this will never happen outside of combat, like in a shroud or anything like that. Overall, I think this affix has a lot of counterplay. I think it's just a way better affix than Quaking, which is like kind of the closest comparable. It doesn't really affect your group comp needs because, yeah, Freedom is nice, but you know, you can just walk out of the 10-yard circle, right? It's not a massive circle. It's pretty easy to get out of. It doesn't affect how you pull a dungeon whatsoever. It's always going to proc on that same timer, no matter how big or small your pulls are. And it's something that I think players both high skill and low to medium skill are going to have a relatively easy time dealing with. So I think it's just a great addition to the affix pool. Then we have Afflicted, which will occasionally spawn a friendly soul mob that will attempt to cast Afflicted Cry. This is a 10-second cast that, if successful, will reduce the haste of all players within 60 yards and in line of sight by 100%, so pretty nasty if this goes off. To stop it, you either need to heal this friendly mob to full health, which can usually be done in about like 2-ish globals depending on the cast, depending if you get a crit. Alternatively, you can target the mob with a poison, disease, or curse dispel, and that will make them instantly disappear, meaning hybrid classes that have access to these kinds of dispels will be very good on these weeks. But even if you're lacking multiple dispels, there's that counterplay via healing them up. Note that I did exclude magic dispels. Magic dispels, or like a Shadow Priest Mass Dispel, for example, aren't going to work. These are not considered a magic buff to dispel off. Now, similar to Entangling, these mobs can only spawn in combat, and they have a 30-second spawn interval. However, mobs don't necessarily have to spawn every 30 seconds, so it's reminiscent of that removed Quaking affix. They had multiple different timing intervals. I don't remember if there are 20 or 30-second intervals on Quaking, but not every interval had to spawn a Quaking. Some of them could be skipped, and that's the same way this affix works. There's also a cap on the number of these souls that can spawn at any one of these intervals, and that cap is 2. So you can have a maximum of 2 afflicted mobs spawn at one time. So that means that you aren't going to be overwhelmed by these if you do like a really big pull, similar to how the old explosive used to work. So nice that they added that in this affix. Now, obviously, there are going to be some issues here. Maybe like if you're doing a pull where there's an important trash dispel, or even a boss that has an important dispel, and because of that, it is pretty good to have multiple dispels available in your group to handle this. Probably 2 to 3 is going to be ideal, 3 being much safer, of course, especially if your healer's dispel is locked up, or if your healer kind of has to be healing on like a dangerous tyrannical fight with like ticking damage, heavy ticking damage, that kind of thing, right? Because in that scenario as well, healing them up may not actually be a viable option because your healer just may not have the available globals. Overall, I actually do like this affix. Initially, it felt maybe this would just become another healer-only affix like Explosive, like Grievous, and while they do interact with this affix more than other players, I actually feel like the job is pretty well split between Dispel classes like hybrids across the board, as well as your healer. I really like the fact that it's capped at 2. Glad they started adding that in, because explosive felt really overly oppressive on certain pulls like that, and I like that it doesn't feel punishing to pull big. You won't feel like you have to massively adjust your routing to deal with it, but there are some maybe team comp considerations in your group when it is Afflicted week. That brings us to the third and final new affix, which is also looking to be maybe the hardest one this season, Incorporeal. Similar to Afflicted, this will spawn a mob that you have to deal with, but this one is hostile, and this one has a 5-second cast in Destabilize that reduces the damage and healing done of all players, again, within 60 yards and within LOS by 50% for 10 seconds. Since these mobs are hostile, this spell can be interrupted. However, an interrupt is actually one of the least efficient ways to stop this cast, as the mob doesn't have a spell lockout, and of course there's a good chance that you want to use your kick on the trash pack that you're probably currently fighting. Luckily, these mobs are also fully CCable, and they count as every family when it comes to these CCs. So Shackle Undead works, Hibernate works, Banish works, doesn't matter the restrictions here, it can CC this mob, with the exceptions of a few things, and that's knockbacks, mind controls, and AoE CCs. None of those will work, so they have to be single target CCs that aren't mind controls. To make life a little easier here as well, this mob has a 100% DR on them, so you won't accidentally cleave them if they spawn close to the pack and break that CC. Using longer CCs is also more preferred here because the mob stays up for 20 seconds or until the end of combat before disappearing. So if you're using something like an interrupt or like a single target stun that lasts a few seconds, you're going to have to invest quite a few globals over the course of that 20 seconds in order to keep the mob locked down. Meanwhile, if you have something like Polymorph, Paralysis, any of the other CCs I just mentioned beforehand, you're able to lock them down for the entire duration with just one cast. Similar to Afflicted and Entangling, these guys again only spawn in combat. However, they have a longer interval at 45 seconds to help match both CDs for some of those longer term CCs, as well as to take into account the fact that these guys exist for 20 of those seconds at a time. Also, just like Afflicted, this 45-second interval doesn't have to happen every time. It can be skipped, again, just like the old Quaking based on RNG. And again, just like Afflicted, capped at 2 spawning at any one time. So having 2 long-term CCs, really nice, assuming their CD is all 45 seconds or less. Otherwise, you may want to have 3, and you may just want to have 3 just for a backup. Overall, I like that they made this affix count as all families. It means that pretty much every class in the game has a long-term CC they can use. Sorry, DKs and Warriors, not accounting you guys, but I do think that having 2 spawn at once on like a boss fight, for example, can be pretty overwhelming sometimes depending on that boss fight. Really would like to see maybe them cap it at 1 in a pure single target scenario, but I guess we'll see. On top of that, the spawn behavior of this affix as well as Afflicted can sometimes be a little far from players, so you can kind of run into range issues. But I think once people actually get used to using the longer term CCs on these mobs, it's not going to be too bad, but it potentially could be pretty rough for pugs for sure. Definitely one of the more impactful affixes of this season. But that is it for this video, guys. Hopefully it helps you going into the new season, and if it did, be sure to leave a like and subscribe for more content like it, including advanced routing guides for all 8 dungeons, raid boss guides, and much more. If you have any questions about any of the affixes, please drop them down in the comments below, or you can always ask me over on my Twitch channel at Tactics, where I stream high keys and mythic raids from a tank POV. As always, shout out to my supporters over on Patreon. I appreciate every single one of you. Your support means a lot. Otherwise, thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.